Carson, Leno, Fallon. Now, it's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today in a beautiful Southern California morning, about to have a conversation with Pauline Vicard of the Areni Global Group. Introductions in just a moment. Wine Talks, of course, available on iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you hang out for podcasting. Hey, have a listen. I just released a conversation with Michael Higgins. He is a photojournalist of wine, and his anthologies of where to go in Bordeaux, Argentina, and the central coast of California are amazing. The photography is amazing. The research is amazing. And I think you'll find it a necessary tome to have when you travel to those destinations. But just coming out, too, is a conversation with Chef Frédéric Castan. And he is from Avignon, came to America in 1975 to be part of the food transition of America, and he was an instrumental part. His book is just released, In the Heat of the Kitchen, From Grandma's Kitchen to Cooking on the Line. A fabulous book. I'm just starting it, and a fabulous conversation. But not while we're here. Here to talk to Pauline Vicard about Areni Global. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, thank you. That's kind of you to say. I know you are co-founder and executive director of Areni Global, and I originally was completely fascinated by the idea that you even called it Areni Global. And maybe, how long has this been around now, the Areni Global?
We started the initiative of bringing people together to think collectively in 2017, and Areni as a brand had starting in 2019. So it's been an evolution, but Areni as a name is 2019.
So, well, I guess 2019, it would have been around a little more. I mean, Areni, as you know, is the indigenous grape of Armenia.
Well, we actually, so to give you the context, but Areni Global is a think tank dedicated to the future of fine wine. So basically what we do is we look at the world and how the world is changing. So from big change like geopolitical change, societal shifts, environmental change, of course, and all those pressures and disruptions, how they impact today or are likely to impact tomorrow the production, distribution, or consumption of fine wine. And the whole idea when we were looking for a name, Areni came, of course, is inspired not just by the grape, but actually by the place in Armenia. Mm-hmm. So the Areni One Cave, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the first trace of winemaking in the world, dating back 6,000 years ago. And so we were really interested in that idea of, to think about the future, we have to understand the past. But also it appears that the Areni Cave was also a collective place. So people were making wine together, a bit like the ancestors of the cooperatives, if you will. Mm-hmm. So because Areni is a collective initiative, because the whole idea is to put people together and, use their brain, use their mind, use their expertise and build on this, on everyone having a piece of the puzzle to actually figure out what the future will look like. We liked also that tribute to the collective work. So that was the whole idea. And the last thing, but a very important one, is also because we are a global initiative. So we've got members and contributors that speak Spanish, Italian, French, English, of course, all sorts of different language. And Areni is a rather easy word to pronounce in all the main languages of wine. So that was also one of the reasons.
It's a fascinating concept, particularly now, since Areni is such an important part of the wine culture because of the cave. We were there in October. We saw the shoes and, toured the cave. Now a very hostile part of the world with the war that just occurred. We have a cousin actually who's building a hotel in Areni that had to suspend construction, but it was going to be a wine destination hotel. It was going to be meant for conferences around wine, capable of 300 people in a conference room and doing things like you're doing. So I just thought that was pretty amazing. And now, of course, Caucasus wines are very important to the world and history of wine, and they're becoming more popular. And I think people now would recognize the term Areni. Have you seen this movie or have you heard about the
I
movie?
have cup of
Yes.
salvation.
How'd
Sorry
you?
to interrupt.
Wow, you're reading my mind. You must be a very good podcaster.
No, well, it's just because, of course, we follow the news, and when we follow the wine news, and when something that shares the same name than us is in the news, and I've been a big fan of all the other Sums movie, and studying how those movies have, impacted the Somme culture. And of course, I've heard a lot about the last one. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure it will be a brilliant film because the other ones were very interesting as well. So I look forward to that. And I've got somewhere at the top of my mind that, for the 10 years anniversary of Areni, we'll need to do something in Armenia. So we'll see how the world is in a couple of years and if that's possible to do. But I like that, again, that relationship to the past and how, the past continues to influence us and to guide us somehow in the future.
Well, it's interesting you brought it up because Vahe is a very good friend of mine. He's been on the show many times. I podcasted with him in Armenia last time we were out, and the story's interesting. It's now streaming, so you can watch it whenever you feel like.
Yeah.
And but he started a co-op, and he's a brilliant. I think, frankly, Vahe is one of the most brilliant winemakers around the world, not just in Armenia. And he went to Armenia after a couple of stints in Italy. He was in Puglia, he was in Tuscany, he was in Berkeley, California with a restaurant and a wholesale company. And that's when I met him years and years ago. But went to Armenia with the idea of a co-op. And you talked about Areni Global being this sort of co-op of think tank of people to, promote fine wine. Tell me what your definition of fine wine is. I think we're going to start there.
Yeah. Well, that's a very, very big question. And I hope you have a bit of time because, of course, we can talk about it for hours. And I wish I had a glass of wine with me, but it's still a bit too early in London. So as I was saying, the whole idea was we started this project with the whole idea of the world is changing so quickly, so rapidly, then regardless of where you are in the fine wine value chain, it is extremely difficult to understand, what the world is going to look like even in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
We started before COVID, so we started thinking about the nenext 15 to 20 years, and now we're kind of thinking about the next 5 years because everything is changing so rapidly.
24 months, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And so, and the first thing that we did, because one of the reasons we focus on fine wine only, and we chose to have that focus on fine wine, it's not because we are exclusive and don't like the rest of the wines, is regardless, and I can say that as an introduction, is regardless how you choose to define fine wine, and even if we came up with a definition, we can still debate that for hours, but it's still out in the open for debate, of course. But regardless of how you decide to define it and the exact words that you choose to describe, they're always at the top of the pyramid. They're always the one that, sit at the pinnacle of quality of what's supposed to be produced within one given category. And we truly believe when we started that when you are seating at the top of the pyramid, that comes with extra responsibilities. And when our industry is faced with so many big challenges, that some of them could be opportunities too, but when you have to rethink the way you farm because of climate change, when you have to rethink the way you distribute because of geopolitical tension, when you have to rethink the way you engage with consumers because of major societal shift, when you are faced with, legal environment that are now questioning the place of alcohol on the table, we strongly believe that the people sitting at the top, it's with great powers come great responsibilities, right? So we didn't think that fine wine and responsibility were associated enough. So that was also one of the reasons we chose to focus on that, because we believe fine wine needs to lead as an example. So that's the introduction on why fine wine. Now, what is fine wine is an extremely interesting concept because the first thing which is interesting is the language and the culture in which we are going to have that conversation is going to influence the nuance of the understanding. Because if you take fine wine in English, it will be slightly different than Grand Cru in French, for example. And some language don't even have a word to actually describe fine wine. So that's the first thing that makes it a fascinating conversation. We started in 2017, so that was the first iteration of the think tank, which is to bring together, experts around the world with a variety of expertise to discuss the future. And our first job was like, we specialize in fine wine. We need to be able to articulate it. We also understand that there's, some dangers facing our industry. So we need to be able to describe it so that we can protect it. So we started by interviewing 250 people in the trade on the first 2 years of our inceptions, and see if, when we were asking them what their definition was, see if we can find some common ground. And then from that common ground from the trade, we then ask consumers what they thought, and to see if consumers were understanding the concept the same way that the trade was, and if not, why. So long story short, we keep researching that topic. We have a white paper that we published in January 2023, so a year ago. That's the 4th edition of the Defined Fine Wine white paper. So we keep on asking people the definition. You're welcome to send your definition to us so that we can integrate it to the verbatim. And every 2 years, we kind of update it. And it started from the beginning with 3 pillars, but spoiler alert, we now have 5. So the definition has extended. The first one that you need, and fine wine needs to have those 5. Like, it's not a pick or choose. It's kind of, you've got to have those 5 together. The first one is some sort of objective criteria. I'm sorry if I just paused. Do you hear that? It's just, you're not
Very
hearing my
faintly.
kids screaming. That's fine.
That's all right.
No, sorry. It's just they were not supposed to be here today, but they're here. So very apology if
It's
that's.
not look, this is a live, not live, but it's a family show, and it's
All
it's
right. So,
colloquial.
so yeah, if you hear people screaming, it's just my kids having fun. So don't worry
Okay,
too
good.
much. So first one is a sort of objectivity, which we call, fine wine needs to be balanced, have harmony, free of all the major defaults, length. I said balance, I think, and capacity to age, which is a very important one as well. And usually ones that will, determine if you are a good wine or a fine wine is your capacity to go through time. Because it's very, very, very important for many different reasons. The second aspect, the second pillar, is totally subjective, which is the wine's capacity to provoke emotion. So you have loads of good wines, but what fine wines do have that others don't is that capacity to stop time. So you will remember everything about that wine. It was 1978 and the fire was cracking and my grandfather opened that bottle of port. And then, you can, in an instant, you can be back to that moment and you remember the smell, you remember the feeling, you remember how the wine made you feel. And it provokes emotion that are so strong that they are now embedded in your personality. And when you think about it, there's not that many wines that provoke those great emotion. We all have, very, very good wine, if you're lucky, on a regular basis. But, those wines that stops the time, there's not that many. And the last one, the last dimension, the last pillar that was here from the beginning of our work is the winemaker's intent. And to me, you can debate for hours what a fine wine is, but it's rather easy to define what a fine winemaker is, because they all share something in common, is that willingness to create something exceptional, to create something which is bigger than themselves, to create something that will, go through time and place, and they all want to do the best. That's something that they all share. The nuance being then that what they think they need to do in order to be the best is going to change from, one philosophy to another, one country to another, one scale to another. The practicality of being the best is going to change, but that vision of that will, that drive is the same across the board. So that was the first 3 ones that we came up with. And then through the years, when we were updating and keeping on asking people what they thought fine wine is, we had 2 extra dimensions that appeared. The 4th one, which, can be qualified a bit as a wishful thinking, I guess, but it's the notion of sustainability and being sustainably produced, because by definition, it takes a long time to make a fine wine. You know, it's a long-term project, it's a long-term investment, and it's, you know, it's not something that you can do if you don't take care of your land, of your people, and of your financial sustainability aspect as well. So that came very strongly back in 2019. That was the dimension that we added. And this year, we're in 2023 for the last edition, we had a very strong debate about reputation and recognition. So the question was, are you beautiful or are you fine just by the fact that you exist and you don't need any recognition? You are inherently beautiful. Or do you need the recognition of the others in order to be seen as beautiful? So if you translate that to wine is, do you need reputation in order to make you fine, or are you just inherently fine? And the trade is a 50-50 split. So some people in the trade very strongly believe that just the fact that the wine is amazing is enough. It doesn't matter if no one knows about this wine. It's, you know, it's fine just on its essence. And 50% would say that no, it needs to be recognized and it needs to have a reputation attached to it. But the reason why we chose to put it in the definition is because the consumers are extremely clear. When you ask the consumer the type of attributes that a wine needs to have in order to be considered fine, the first thing or the second thing, depending on the market, but it's always in the top two, is it has to come from a well-known region or a well-known producer. So reputation is inherently linked to the understanding of fine wine for the consumer. So that's why we added it. So if I summarize those 5 pillars, something which is objective quality, balance, length, you know, harmony, elegance, power, all of that. Second is subjective capacity to provoke very strong emotions. Third one is the intent and the willingness of the maker to do something great. Fourth one is being sustainably produced. And last one is it needs to have a well-known and established reputation. Did I answer your question? Sorry for that very long essay.
No.
You're welcome to edit and cut
No,
me.
I mean,
Thank
these
you
are
so
like,
much.
these are amazing subjects, and each one of them is its own conversation, its own podcast. And before I get into some of the things that stimulate some thoughts here, because there are some amazing pieces here, and it seems like the first 3 were more, and maybe because they were the primary functions of the Areni Global, which was, they're more about the wine itself and its ability to age, its character, all the things that go into making a glass of wine. And I have my new term, which I call an honest glass of wine, since we have so much dishonest wine in the marketplace, but that's sort of what that lines up with. The rest of it seems more, I'm not going to say political. Sustainability, I think, is past the political definition now. I think it's part of a culture, an important part of our culture. And I think that if there's any industry in the world that should be sustainable and that should be able to practice sustainability, it's wine. It's a little harder when you're making widgets or, you know, microprocessors or, you know, camera equipment. It's a little different. But I think with wine, it's a clearly obvious industry. But how does Global Areni, is it a group of people? Is it an executive board that sort of decides these things, or do you join as a winery or as a consumer to move the needle?
So the way it works is we consider ourselves as a platform for conversation and for important conversations. So my role as the executive director is to bring together experts from both the wine world, but also from outside of the wine world, because if you want to understand geopolitics, sustainable farming, you know, societal shifts, the relationship of people with their food and how they eat, all of those topics that are central for the future of fine wine, you need to go and get outside perspective as well, because, you know, we're usually not very experts in geopolitics in wine or finance or tech. So I'd say that usually in the conversation that we organize, depending on the topic, but we have up till 40% of the contributors that are not related to wine directly. And so my role is to come up with what hopefully relevant question for our industry, and then bring the minds around the table to hopefully have some takeaways to publish, to analyze, and to distribute to the rest of the community. So some of our conversation are very 360 degree. So, what's the place of viticulture in sustainability. I'm going to use it, but as a default word, because I totally agree. There's loads of politics behind that word and loads of nuance. And again, we can talk about it for hours. But we work with, for example, experts from Chatham House, which is a geopolitical think tank in the UK, or the Brookings Institute on your side of the pond. We're going to work with the Observatoire des Habitudes Alimentaires des Français. So that's the observatory that observe the food habits of French people, for example, to see how the French way of eating is changing, because of course that has consequences for us. We work with experts in AI and all of those things. And then we establish a research program for 2 years, some very big global questions. We always start with a global question, and then we funnel it down to very practical question into how it actually impacts the wine industry and what can we do in order to minimize challenge and maximize opportunities, basically.
That's crazy. You just two things just hit me as you're speaking. One, just as a side note, Amy Kashkarian, this daughter of and winemaker from Wineworks in Armenia, is in Burgundy right now. Since you're Burgundian, she's there studying. So she's advancing herself in the world of wine past Armenia and now studying, I think, one of the greatest place for wine in Burgundy.
Yeah.
But let's kind of go back to that for a second. All of these things that Global Areni are doing, Areni Global, are relatively contemporary issues. In other words, let's go back to the 13th century, you and me, and the monks that were making Burgundy and figured out that Chasson Montrachet was better than the one across the street, or at least produced different grapes. None of this was important. It wasn't at all. Everything was fine wine. Everything would, by your definition, except for the ones that we just established, the last three. But the first three were inherent into the world of wine. There was no other choice to do. And I'm wondering, this is a human cause situation. Politics, business, profitability has forced us to redefine and look at wine as a beverage that does, and I think the strongest definition you just gave is the one that has you emote. I think that's what a good glass of honest wine means. And it won't emote if it's loaded with sugar or it's loaded with acids or it's been doctored up, all the things that go into shelf item or formula wines that can't. But man, a properly made wine will automatically, almost invariably, without even having to have experience like being, in front of the Parthenon or the Colosseum or something. And I'm going to highlight that real fast. We went to dinner the other night. I took a mainstream, big Napa cab. Everybody loves it. It's not cheap, but I took it because I knew people would go, "Oh, hey, you brought," I won't throw any names out there. We're not going to do that right now. And I brought some wine from Armenia, the ones I think are really special as far as expression. And man, they outperformed a wine. They'd never heard of the grape. They'd never heard of the maker. They had never heard of the location. And it's up against, one of the greatest brands in Napa history. And it wins, so to speak. Is that what you're talking about? Those kinds of experiences?
I'm not sure, because there's so much to impact in what you've just said.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you said that resonates with at least why I am personally doing this and why it's a job that I particularly enjoy is, so I grew up in Burgundy. My parents were winemakers in Burgundy, so I grew up there. I worked in wine all my life. But when I say that, people tend to have like stars in their eyes and, "Oh, it's amazing, you must be drinking all the cool wines." Well, Burgundy 40 years ago, at least my part of Burgundy, was a very, very different place than it is today. So my parents had a very, very traditional model in Burgundy, which is that they were making wine and they were selling it to the négoce. And the négoce in Burgundy, which is fairly different than the négoce in Bordeaux. And then the négoce would, put a brand on those wines and raise them and do the élevage and then sell them under the brand.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons that motivated me in doing what I do now is that over my generation, I've seen the job of, and it's difficult for me to use the word winemaker because it translates a very different reality in California that it is in Burgundy. But if I say vigneron, it's not really international, vocabulary matter in those things. But in a generation, the work of my parent transformed totally. I mean, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, it was just enough to make good wine, and that was okay. And you were operating within a family business that has a very, very different meaning and reality that what a family business is today. And in 40 years, it was not only enough to make wine, but you had to be able to sell it and build distribution. And then it's not just you have to be able to build a distribution, but you also have to be able to engage with your consumers. So there's three phases of wine, which is production, distribution, and consumption, that historically, until very, very recently, have been done by separate actors on the supply chain. You were either a specialist of production, either a specialist of distribution, or either a specialist of consumption, like the sommeliers and the people that were face to face with the final consumer, is now merging in a very complex industry. That's another word which is important, because 40 years ago, you wouldn't talk about industry when you were referencing the wine world, which is still, as a French person, still why I have a problem with the word wine industry, because I grew up in a place where it was insulting to refer to wine as an industry, because it's not an industry. It's something like farming, agriculture, and beauty and all of that, and not something gross that fabricates things and sell it for money. So the environment of wine has extremely changed in 40 years, and it has left a lot of people behind, or it has required a lot of acquisition of skills and resources of the ones that have stayed, at least in the old world, because I mean, that's another debate, but I think the old world, new world is still it's a dichotomy that's still interesting to make, not to describe the style of wine, but to describe the mindset of people and their background and their history. And they've got separate histories and separate mindsets and separate backgrounds. So at least when I take the case of what I know best, which is, the French wine ecosystem, that transition over 40 years has been quite, not violent, but it's been such a massive change that there's enough to make your head spin. And that's why, I don't know if you've been hearing that in the news in the US, but right at this moment, farmers and winemakers are marching down the roads in Paris with tractors and also in Brussels to actually shout the fact that they're not happy about the situation. Because again, in 40 years, there's loads of sociology studies that have shown that the farmer class is the one that changed the most in 40 years. And my dad's job has evolved so much in 40 years that I've seen, again, I've experienced that change, and I know how hard it can be to suddenly go from being an expert in one thing. I've needed to master those three things. And that's my motivation for Areni. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. I think this is...
But that linked to the fact that you mentioned that those were contemporary issues. And I totally agree. Those are contemporary issues, because the wine world is a complex ecosystem enough. Va voir papa, s'il te plaît. Va voir Margot avec papa, il va te mettre le film si tu veux. Very, very sorry for this. I hope you can edit the podcast, and I'm sorry if I make extra work for you. They're the next generation of wine lovers.
Are you kidding?
No, I'll take them out, not everywhere, but I take them to most places. My oldest is 8, my younger is 4, and they love tasting wines. We cook together.
I love it. It's beautiful.
And when people see me with them, sometimes I've been stopped at like trade show where people are like, "Excuse me, miss, are you French?" And I'm like, "Yeah, how do you know?" Well, French people are the only ones that, allow 3-year-olds to taste wine. And I'm like, "Yeah, they're not drinking, they're tasting. It's a totally different exercise." Anyway, sorry, that was just to bounce on your point of those are contemporary issues. Yes, because the disruptions that we have. They've been starting 40 years ago, but they've been accelerated so much that it would have taken 100 years before for people to need to do those transitions. So you would have 3 or 4 generations to adapt. And now you need to do all those adaptations in 1 generation, 2 tops. And that's what makes it challenging. And as we've seen since COVID, the world seems to be changing every year anyway. So there's that acceleration of change and that need for extra resilience that led also to the build of Areni and those conversation platform.
It was fabulous objective by the Areni Global. It reminds me of, and my son-in-law, one of them is an Anglican priest in New York, and my other son-in-law is going to seminary school, and it reminds me of the business of church. I mean, church as a religion is got its purposes and for people, and it's very important. But the running of the church, which becomes a human issue, is very difficult to do because it's very hard to delineate between, or at least carry on Christian principles while you're trying to do business. That's hard. And it reminds me of the story of the Burgundian winemaker. And I think, when was the last time they appellated? Like in the 30s or something?
Sorry?
When was the last time that the Burgundians got together and appellated? I think it was like 35 or 32 or something. That they just,
to determine the appellation?
Yeah.
It started in 36.
Yeah. Okay. So there was a comment made during one of those meetings where the vigneron said, I don't think we should advertise. I don't think we should be allowed to advertise as a controle of this appellation, because if we make the proper wine, people are going to come, like build a better mousetrap. And yes, there's an industry now, unfortunately, and it gets in the way and it creates consumer confusion, but it also, unfortunately, they're producing wines that people like to drink, and it kind of takes us away from this definition.
I don't think, I totally see your point with the church thing. There are some similarities, but I think, again, that's open for debate. But what's interesting to me is sometimes people, we've done a lot of nuance, like the difference between fine wine and classics, and fine wine and investment grade wine, and fine wine and luxury wine, for example. And the fine wine versus luxury wine to me is a very interesting one, because if you look at our definition, fine wine is mostly about the product, and it's mostly about the wine, the vision of the one that makes it, and the consumer or the drinker just appears somehow in the definition when it says that, fine wine provokes emotions and wonders to the one drinking it. When you take the luxury wine definition, the ones that Liz Thatch and Peter Young have done for their books, Luxury Marketing Wines, which is a great book, by the way. And it's also a very great definition. And I can't remember it by heart, but it places the consumer at the center. So luxury wines is here to serve the consumer and the way they feel and the status and everything. And it's amazing to me that we've got the fine wine that places the product first, and the luxury wine that plays the consumer first. And it's not a judgment. One is not best than the other, but depending on the market which I am, or the audience which I am, people will have very, very strong feelings about this. So in France, people are clearly the fine wine team. Like we don't care about selling wine. We don't want to make money. We just want to create something beautiful. I've written an article to explain how it connects to the French notion of luxury and to God, actually, because the idea was to create something worthy of God, something bigger than yourself. It's always been engraved in French luxury. But then when I'm in front of other market, people are like, how can you create something and not even consider the consumer? How selfish is that? Like, how can you just have one product and do not care about the consumer? And there's a lot of trouble that came to the wine industry because for years, we didn't care about the consumer at all. So I guess it's a balance. Like, of course, wine is a beautiful product that exists and is beautiful on its own, and it's here to provoke magic and emotion. But it needs to rely on an industry and distribution system and to making money at some point in order to reach the consumer and be able to provoke those emotions. So there's very rarely one without the other. And today, wine can't really exist without the industry. And I guess that's where the intersections and the fascinating conversation happens.
Absolutely. And the toughest question I ask, depending on who's sitting in the seat, is like what would happen? How could you theoretically or even philosophically say, um, or predict what would happen if profitability had nothing to do with this? There's no way to do that, obviously, but let's just, I mean, go back to Madame Clicquot and shipping wine to Russia, whatever. She's trying to make a buck, right? So, but what if that didn't exist? Like, would it be a different product? Would we have different objectives in creating a bottle of wine if we weren't worried about selling it? In other words, do we cut corners? Do we worry about the glass, the type of cap, the capsule? And so I have this Venn diagram in my head when it comes to wine, which is the core, and maybe it's the fine wine definition you're talking about. Maybe it's the luxury wine definition you're talking about. In the middle circle is something that's unadulterated by consumerism. It's a beverage that's made historically, that we've made before profitability was an issue.
But it's never been a product. I mean, again, people tend to oppose consumers, like if wine was been made in a vacuum. But it's never been like, the markets have always influenced the wine. And so you were talking about, back in the days, but the reason why Burgundy is because of the kings of France that were drinking it and influenced the market. The reason why Bordeaux is because of the British, and that dates back from the 14th century. And the market actually influenced the style of wine that was produced, and the people that bought the wines, that might have been different than the people that drink the wines that gave you that. But the people that bought the wines have always had an influence on the wines themselves and on the methodology of making and in farming. I don't think that's something new. And I think that it's sometimes a romanticized idea of having, the winemaker that makes his wine on his own without any kind of influence of the market or any kind of external influence that could bias his view and alter his view, because they never exist in a vacuum. They always are inspired and impacted by, from memorial time, people have needed to sell their wines, and they've changed the alcohol content because the wine had to travel. Why the Languedoc-Roussillon is in that situation today is because they had the railways 100 years later than they had to wait for railways to be able for their wines to get outside of their local doors, because they had no rivers that they could navigate on, like the Rhone Valley had, or like Burgundy had, or like Bordeaux had an open sea to go to the Britain. So again, I think it's sometimes a romanticized idea that there's something pure as a winemaker that makes his wine outside of any kind of marketability concept. It's always played a role.
I agree with that. I am a romantic when it comes to the subject. I realize that, and I think it's just expanding the definition so that let's say my father went to Napa in 1974. He stopped at Sutter Home. There's this young man named Bob Trincaro behind the counter. He was alone. He says, "Hey, I want you to taste something. Here's this white Zinfandel." And I don't know what to do with it because it seems too sweet for my regular, Eye of the Partridge wine kind of thing. And, there is a great example of marketing a brand that the consumer wanted to take, that he didn't know he created the need. And I get it. This is business, and we have to do this. So we make things that people want to drink. And there was one quote that I read years ago, and it angered me because the person was arguing that the wine industry does not cater to the consumer. It needs to do a better job of it. If they want to drink sweet wine, then let's make them sweet wine. Much like beer, you put your SWOT analysis. You say, oh, we got a light beer here that's made from wheat, and we don't have one over here made from neutral grain or whatever. And now we fill a gap. And I have a huge problem with that to a certain extent. Like, no, wine does have to carry with it some kind of regional or varietal character. And recently, with the conversation with the Cheval Blanc CFO, he says, yeah, we wrestle with brand recognition so that people open a bottle of Cheval Blanc and they go, this is Cheval Blanc. But also our requirement is to show what this terroir and what that weather was like. And so when we do take it across the country, across the world, it says, this is who we were and it's when we were. And that's what we're expressing here. So it's kind of a balance between, marketing.
It's a balance. And for example, we shouldn't forget that the word typicity, or typicité in French, was cornered in the 90s by agroeconomists, because that's when France started to have international competition. So typicity, the fact that a wine tastes differently because it comes from a different place, might be a fact, but it's most importantly has been a marketing argument. It was a way of French people to defending themselves, because if you market the fact that there's no other places in the world that can produce your wine because your place is unique, then of course there's no competition. So it's both a reality, and you and me, I mean, I can't come from Burgundy and not believe in terroir. I've seen it, I've tasted it. I'm convinced that terroir exists, and I'm convinced that terroir is a beautiful thing that includes both climate, soil, and human, and the human being the people that makes the wine, but the people that buy the wine as well, that do have an influence. But it's also a protectionist argument. It's both. And for me, it's that duality that's really interesting in wine as well. It's we all need consumers, because without consumers, there's no sustainability. And I know, and I meet those French people, again, I can talk mostly about French people, but people that would rather give away their wines than not selling it to people that are genuinely interested in their product, to sell them to consumers that simply have the money, but they don't really connect in an emotional level, intellectual level with them. But the fact is, without consumers, there's no survival. And I guess the needle is, where do you put the consumers or the market in the equation? And fine wine tends to be, I do my thing, I get my inspiration from whomever inspires me, I make my wine to the best of my ability, and then my job is to find my niche and my consumer so I can sell that to them. And then it seems that some other wines that people tend to qualify as luxury wine would be, let's start from the consumer, what they want, and then craft a wine around that. But I guess it's that subtle nuance in who has the biggest influence in the way you think about your wine, but they always untangle in some sort of way, if that makes sense. Sorry,
It does.
I got very philosophical for one second.
No, it's a serious, it's something I think about all the time. And I have transitioned from, my business. I sold something like 17 million bottles in my career, and everything was primarily less than $20, most of it. And then all of a sudden, when I sold the company and the gentleman bought all the wines that he could sell through the system, he did not buy the things that I had collected, not necessarily because I wanted to be a collector of these luxury wines, but because during COVID, they were buying anything I told them to buy. It didn't matter. Price was almost irrelevant. And so I was selling wines for $100, $200 a bottle that I would never be able to sell during a regular course of a year. Well, now I have them. So I have like 2,500 bottles, Grand Cru, Aremia Cru, classified growth. I mean, it's beautiful. And my mind shift, and I don't like it. I've shifted to this idea of a collector. And I'm thinking to myself, I see these wonderful wines I built to sell at the house, and I see this Costa Esternel, and I'm like, boy, if I drink that, I don't have it anymore. And wow, how tragic that would be, instead of like really enjoying the glass of wine.
That's my big problem on a personal level. To give you something very personal, is that I'm attached to every single bottle that I've got in my cellar.
Yes.
And that's the biggest. It's such a biggest battle. Like, if I drink it, I know that it will never find that exact same wine again. And so to me, coming to the UK and living in London, Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand and Malbec from Argentina changed my life, because I can drink those wines because they will always taste the same. I mean, if you take the cliche,
right.
Of course, I'm not talking about the exception of those wines, but I really understand why those wines had such a success in the market, because there's a comfort in knowing that regardless of what you're going to order at the restaurant, or regardless of the type of Sauvignon Blanc that you are going to buy from New Zealand, depending on the price, you kind of know the type of complexity that you will get with that. But you will have a similar style every time. And those wines have changed the way I drink wine. Like, I will drink a glass of wine, of those wines, when I cook, because I can just enjoy those wines and don't have to think about it too much. And I know that if I want to come back to it another day, it will taste similar, because I think sometimes I'm a bit too intellectual with the rest of the bottle. And then I ended up not drinking them, which is sad too,
That's very sad. I had to say something just real quick before I forget. and you were talking about your kids who taste wine and they enjoy it. My kids always did, but there is a poster from 1932 or 36, I can't remember, from Béziers. It's a 8.5 by 11 blue paper, and it's all in French, obviously. And it talks about that wine is not responsible for alcoholism, and that you should have 2 liters a day during meals, and it's okay to serve to a young person that's 4 years older, 4 years old, as long as you add ajoute de l'eau, if you add water to it. And it's a fascinating PR piece. I've been trying to find one, a legit one, and there happens to be a poster shop in Bonn.
I'm sure you will find some at the Athenaeum in Bonn, or even online. I've seen a lot in some museums as well that you will find.
You know what I'm talking about? This
well,
poster?
I know all those campaigns, and like the Victory French woman that says, that has wine on one hand and milk on the other one, saying that's how you go strong. Well,
I'm going to email you the link.
Yeah, in today's world, I can't really agree with that. Like, I believe that moderation is the key to wine appreciation. And Laura Catena says it really well, but moderation is also a love language. If you love people, you need to advise them moderation, because we know today the damage that that excess alcohol consumption can cause. And of course, it's not responsible today to serve. I mean, you can have, pleading guilty, like my kids do taste. The rule in my house, it's how I grew up, is the minute the kid asks to taste something, you say yes, but you teach them the difference between tasting and drinking, or tasting and eating. So the minute my girls have been willing to taste wine, they've been allowed to, to pour their little finger in the glass and taste it, and then slowly put their lip on the glass as they grow up. But I do that with everything. Like if they ask me to taste the cat's food, please don't call child services on me. But I will say yes, like it's a part, and then they never come back. No, not the things that are dangerous, obviously, not the product to clean the bathrooms and stuff. But it's a way, I believe that by nurturing that curiosity of taste, you're also nurturing moderation and mindful eating, because then you develop an interest in what you're eating or drinking. And then because you're interested, you stop for a moment, you consider, you remember, and you eat or you drink less, but you tend to eat or drink better because you're interested in what you're doing. So
I've been actually trying to study what was happening in the south of France that this poster was created, because it was put out by the Institute of Wine. It was some
probably the Interprofession or something.
Yeah,
of a
there must have been
collective body.
something happening, socially that forced them or required them to put it out there. There's something I wanted to touch.
Well, and also to go back to history, but at that time, the wine that they were drinking was very much different than the wine that they were drinking now. They were drinking 8% wine. They were not drinking 40.5% Cabernet with extra sugar. They were drinking low alcohol wines because they were diluted, not because it was trendy, just because it was diluted and the grapes were not ripe enough, and because it was produced in mass volume. And also because wine was considered an aliment. So it was meant to bring you calorie. And also, if you rewind a bit before, because wine was also considered a healthy, just like beer, a healthy drink because of fermentation. So it would kill all the microbes and genes that normally you would find in improper water. But of course, all of those facts are not transferable to today's day, where in most countries the tap water is highly drinkable, and in most countries you don't find wine that are 7% alcohol, but you find 14.5% wine. So it's a totally different context.
You it's almost as if you read this poster, because it talks about that Tavel. What's that? Bleach? What's bleach in French?
Javel.
Yeah. So there's
Tavel being the rosé in the Rhone Valley.
Sorry,
not to be confused.
It talks about that there's bleach in water. And so don't drink too much water, drink more wine.
Yeah.
And in fact, I didn't bring the book with me. There's another book that from Dr. Murray. Have you heard of this gentleman? He created a book in the 70s. It's basically a whole book on human maladies and the appropriate cure.
Is it the guy of the The French paradox. No, that's not
No,
him.
no. This
Not
is
yet. Oh, okay.
71, 72. I'll send you both the links.
Okay.
In fact, there's also a video I just saw of him from the 70s. But he talks about, cardiac issues, nerve issues, all kinds of issues, diarrhea, and then the proper wine, and they're all French, of course,
Yeah.
to associate that. But let's go back to something. Let's go back. We've gotten off track a little bit, but this last definition, and we're at 50 minutes already, so we don't.
I know.
It's unbelievable. But I want to sort of get your opinion of this. The last definition you talked about, which is the well-known region or well-known varietal or a well-known brand, and this is a tricky one because it is about branding. Wine is branding. I mean, I have a niece who wants to start a salad dressing line. She's well in her way of trying to release this thing, and I'm like, man, you're up against Procter and Gamble, trying to get shelf space from Paul Newman or Kraft, or Wishbone. It's impossible to do. And so, how do you add that definition when areas like Friuli are becoming popular, and right next door in Slovenia, and then Armenia is now popular, and brand building is so hard to do? How do you add that?
So brand building is extremely hard to do, and it's also hard to do in an industry where the marketing budgets are really, really small compared to any other drinks, because people forget. I mean, the Barbie movie was a success not just because of the quality of the film and the topic but it was also successful because of the marketing budget that was as much as the production budget.
Exactly.
So in literature, like in books, you have a direct correlation between the success of the book and the marketing budget that comes with it. And there's a ceiling that you can't go over if you don't have the money to have the marketing budget for it. So building a brand in an industry that generally doesn't have money is extremely difficult. It takes a lot of time. And historically, and that's what's interesting today, and look at it changing in the fine wine segment, is that traditionally always come with a collective part, because for me, and that's my personal opinion, but to make it out there, you either have to play collective and play with your region. And if you want to be associated with fine wine, the reason why Bordeaux and Burgundy are associated with fine wine, or Napa for that matter, is because there's a big enough group of people that are making quality wine to be seen entirely as a region that makes quality wine. And that trickles down to everyone, and that serves down everyone. Even with the people of the Bourgogne Blanc and the Bourgogne Alicoté are going to sell it for a more expensive price that the counterpart in the Loire Valley, or the counterpart in the Languedoc-Roussillon, for example, or in Napa, the counterpart in Sonoma or Paso Robles, because the region is not as well known collectively. And that's the whole purpose of the interprofession, and why they still matter today, is that there's need to be, if you want to put your wine out there, either you penfold and you've got an unlimited, or you LVMH and you Dom Pérignon and you've got almost an unlimited marketing budget, and you have very, very talented talent as well, because, I know their team, they are extremely skilled people that you don't often come across in the wine industry. Or you have a collective approach. And that has been, again, typicity existed, the notion of terroir existed because it's based on a collective approach to style, and it's based on a collective approach to quality. And what's interesting today with fine wine is that we are shifting away from the concept of typicity to a concept of authenticity, which is, I'm not doing whatever people are telling me to do. I'm not doing whatever my region has telling me to do, like history has told me that I need to harvest at that date. I'm going to wait another 2 weeks and see I want to make the wines that I want to make, and not the wines that, the collective group is telling me to do, or the appellation system is telling me to do, even if that costs me to get out of the appellation system. And that's a very interesting shift, is how individual brands are emerging. But they are even more difficult to make emerge if you come from a region which is not well known. And if you come from a region which is not well known and are working with a grape variety that is not well known, it's extremely difficult to be something else than niche. They will be niche. There's there's places for everyone. It all depends on the scale that you want to, and it all depends on the resources that you have and the boots on the ground that you have to make your wine well known and appreciated.
It's I asked the chef yesterday, I said, despite all the passion it takes to be in the industry, my daughter's a boulangère. She went to Alain de Casse's patisserie, l'école de patisserie à Saint-Jean. And, without the passion, it's almost impossible. And I think, there's plenty of winemakers that just went through school or they're cellar rats and they became winemakers, but don't have the passion. And you have to taste that passion. In the food, you have to taste the passion in the wine. And how do you define that? Well, it's kind of unwritten. It just becomes something that, and then even then, if you have it, the popularity of your wine may never, ever get past the niche market. It may never happen. It may just because a bunch of devotees or zealots of your wine collected, and hopefully based on that, you can make $1, which is getting harder and harder to do.
But
in our industry.
I mean, if you had to come with a recipe, and I'm asked that question all the time, but I guess before to make it out there in the quality place, to be successful in the quality spectrum, whatever you want to call it, premium, fine wine, luxury, you have to pay attention to every single details when it comes to production. And that's a given. And people know that. And you have to be passionate. You have to work hard. And again, there's no compromise for quality when it comes to the product that you want to produce. But then what's changing is over the last 20 years, people have started to get that level of commitment within their distribution, something that before they would have let intermediary control. Now, even if they don't sell direct, they will have a much more precise approach to their distribution system. They will have a closer relationship to every distributors and retailer that they work with, and they will make the same kind of detail-oriented choice for their distribution system that what they are doing for the production system. And what's new now and has been accelerated with COVID is now they are tackling the last step, the last building block, which is consumption. And they are trying to apply the same level of detail-oriented and quality focus and service focus and excellence focus within their relationship with the consumer. Again, even if they don't sell direct, even if they've got intermediaries, they still want to develop a relationship direct with the consumer that will be focused on excellence of service, excellence of relationship. And I guess that's something that also makes their job harder, right? And so if you can't do it all, then your partners are something even more precious today, because they are the ones that will help you get there, even on a small marketing budget and even on a small resources, should you have an amazing product to sell.
Well, my new profession, is that English? Profession is consulting in that world. And of course, America is totally different than the rest of the world when it comes to distribution. We have a huge problem in the California, U.S. market, where the consolidation of distributors is occurring in a large fashion. A lot of the boutique distributors can't get traction. And my number one phone call is from wineries saying, how do I get into the market? And it's like, and I have a friends, and we're going to wrap this up now, but they just got out of the hospitality world of restaurant. They used to own a fine restaurant here in L.A., and they decided to get into RTDs, ready to drink cocktails, and they make a beautiful one. They make a London dry martini you wouldn't believe compared to my homemade one. It's pretty close. But I spoke with them the other day as they're driving down the 5 freeway to go to San Diego to set up a booth at the Total Wine and More and hand pour a 1/4 ounce for consumers. In other words, build their brand. Southern Wines and Spirits or Young's or RNDC or whoever's managing the show for them is not going to build the brand. That interface has to occur with them. I mean, the work that goes behind that creation is impossible.
It's the winery's job to build their brands. It all falls down to the winery. And of course, the partners can help, but that brand building, is based on them and on their work, really.
It's tough. This is fascinating. It's already an hour. We have to wrap it up. We're going to do it again because there's so much more to talk about. I owe you the video with Dr. Murray talking about the health benefits of wine. I owe you a link to the Le Fiche de Béziers because it's so fascinating. I actually had it painted on my wall, my old office. It was so fun. And I owe you a link to the book, Dr. Murray's book on the
I'd love to.
health
Thank
benefits
you.
of wine.
And thank you so much for having me. It's been a fun hour. Sorry for the noise disturbance.
Not a problem. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know it's dinner time there in London, so we will wrap it up now. And I will send you the links when this is all wrapped up. And we'll continue the conversation. I'd love to keep abreast of what's going on over there at Areni Global.
It would be my pleasure. Bye, Paul.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to Wine Talks with Paul Kalamkarian. Don't forget to subscribe because there's more great interviews on their way. Folks, have a great time out there in the wine world. Cheers.